everyone. Welcome to another DC Flutter meetup. We have today with us Randal Schwartz. Randal, take it away. You're going to be talking about Riverpod, right?
Yes, Riverpod, Flutter in general a bit, and the counter app once again, and also what I call Riverpod Hooks, but it's not technically correct. The Hooks is actually a completely separate package, but it plays well with Riverpod because it can do some things like that. So I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I have to face away from the camera to look at my other screen over here. But yeah, you see this. I don't know.
Actually, Randal, can you give us a few minutes, just maybe a minute introduction? It's just tell us who you are, because you've been around, and I've known you for a while from your shows. There might be people that may or may not know you. So can you give us a brief introduction? I know you're a Flutter GDE. Just tell us about yourself for a minute, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I've been involved professionally in the computer industry for over 4 decades. So I started back when uppercase only teletypes were the rage. So it's been a while. I started slightly after punch cards, though, so there was at least a little bit of a gap. So I never got to use a punch card machine, so that's fine. Paper tape, though, I played with paper tape. So been doing all sorts of tasks, mostly because I get bored and switch off to different things. So I would have been, I started life teaching myself programming, but then my only early job I could get at the largest employer in the state of Oregon, my home state, was doing technical writing. So I got trained in the fine art of technical writing. And so I became dual versed, which is actually an asset, because usually people who know writing don't know programming and vice versa. And when Perl came along, I created a series of books to help people understand Perl, and effectively made it the darling language of the web, and helped promote the web into e-commerce and everything else on that side. And also ran a training company of Perl teachers, Perl trainers, which is also quite fun. But I wrote my first code for hire in 1977, so I do go back a ways. Lately, I have been spending a lot of time with Dart and Flutter. Dart when it first came out, and Flutter when it first came out. So I was right on the bleeding edge for both of those, and ended up becoming a Google developer expert, as you just mentioned. That's a shortened down to GDE, and those are experts that have been vetted by Google to represent the projects and products that Google is cranking out. All of them open source, of course, but you do need advocates out there in the field. One of the ways to describe my job is unpaid DevRel. So I sort of sit between the home team in Mountain View and the public at large, seeing what needs to be said from one to the other and vice versa, and being that liaison for everybody. And in that capacity, I've been doing a lot of meetups like this, where I get to share some of my knowledge. I'm mostly sharing my knowledge by being on about 9 different chat areas and chat rooms, community Slacks, Discord, Stack Overflow, Reddit, and watching for questions there under RSS feeds. And basically just trying to answer as many things as I can, as often as I can. I don't answer everything, thank goodness, because otherwise I'd be up all night instead of just most of the night. So I've become enamored with Riverpod since I first read about it. The brief thing to learn about Riverpod is that it is a state management system. State management is about 2 main things, 3 if you count the third one. The 2 main things are data rendezvous, how to find your data wherever it is. And the second one is just as important, and why you can't just use global variables. It's to be notified when that data changes. So those are critical in an application for mobile or web, where you have to understand when these values are changing in what we call the model classes, where the data actually has no visual representation, so that they can notify the views on the other side, which is the only thing the user can look at. So state management, there's a number of different frameworks for that. Probably one of the earliest popular ones was Provider. And Provider allows you to, again, have data in one place and hook up with it in another place and be notified whenever the data changes. And it was built around a mechanism that internally is called inherited widget. So it's tied into the chain of context, 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 build context all the way down. It's tied into that system, and is necessarily so, because that was the communication path from the thing providing the data to the thing using the data, and vice versa. And Remy, whose last name I'm not going to try to pronounce because I'm probably going to get it wrong, French guy. Remy wrote Provider, and Google, in a sense, blessed it by having code labs that used it, by putting it on their front page for state management, things like that. But there were some fundamental flaws to Provider that could not really be addressed without a break in syntax. And so Remy came up with version 2, essentially, which is called Riverpod. And if you'll take a moment to notice, Riverpod and Provider are anagrams of each other. So it's just the letters rearranged. You can't call it Provider 2 because it's not a drop-in replacement. It has everything Provider had in terms of functionality, but expressed in, I would say, simpler functionality or simpler syntax, a lot less boilerplate. The other thing is that it's not tied to Flutter. You can easily use the same techniques with a straight Dart program. For example, to have some kind of dependency management between, say, you're watching a stream over here and you're outputting strings or files over here. You could have the glue between the two of them be Riverpod in a Dart program. That's not possible with Provider because it expects that chain of contexts to get data from one place to the other, but it's the same functionality. In fact, you use most of the same providers. So I became fascinated by it because it was the heir apparent to Provider, and state management is pretty much necessary in anything that's longer than a single widget or two, which is pretty much everything that you want to do that's practical. Now, when you create a Flutter project, use Flutter create and a name of a file, you end up with the wonderful, and I think we're still sharing this, right? You end up with this wonderful counter widget, right? Wonderful counter stuff. Okay, let me just start something else over here. Hold on.
By the way, Randall, just quick reminder to everyone, please ask your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the Q&A segment after the presentation.
Yeah, I can't get to my taskbar now. Okay. Oh, it's behind that. That's weird. No, I don't want to open trash. Why is it? Oh, because this is on top. That's why I can't see it. Okay, just a second. Let me pull up my terminal window in a place where you won't see it. Okay, good. All right, so you're over there, right? Okay, so here we have, I haven't done anything special. This is Flutter Create. I'm going to have next to a simulator that I will be using for my demonstration. I don't need to launch the counter app. You have all done this once. And I also claim, that since you create with Flutter Create, it gets this project and you delete out all the comments, delete out about half the other code, that this one application has had more lines of code deleted from it than any single application has written into it. So this is the poor sacrificial lamb as we create brand new Flutter programs. Okay, so I don't need to show you that. That's just that. Okay, and I'm pointing that way because it's towards the screen that I'm actually looking at, in case you're curious about orientations here. Okay, well, I don't really need the counter app once again. So let me do a couple things here. Let me type something, and let's first delete everything that's in there. Okay, bye-bye counter app. Now, why did I delete all that? Because I want to use Riverpod instead. And I have a Riverpod Starter Kit. I've done a video about it in my Randal Schwartz on Dart and Flutter if you want to go see that. I'm sure somebody will link to that somewhere in here. And the starter kit looks like this. Let me walk through it a bit because it's actually sort of essential. Can everybody see my cursor okay, or do I need to highlight everything?
I can see it. Yeah, we can see your cursor. Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, that way I can just scroll and point rather than having to select. If I'm not sharing the screen, then I have to do it this way. That just gets to be really annoying. Okay, so usually this is Visual Studio Code, by the way. Really like it. It's my preferred editor for this kind of stuff. And I have a zillion extensions added to it as well. So the material Dart, of course, automatic. The other two things I have in here are the two primary packages for Riverpod. There's Flutter Hooks, which are like hooks from React Native or React. And in fact, Remy wrote that to be specifically as close as possible. I didn't understand his documentation until I ran off and looked at the actual JavaScript hooks package. And so that's that. And we'll be using one of those today. And then Hooks Riverpod takes hooks on one side and all the Riverpod packages on the other side and incorporates them all into my current code. Now, we aren't seeing anything yet. I haven't scrolled all the way down to here. Just like you put your provider at the top level, Riverpod requires precisely one provider scope, and typically it's built in Run App, and it has the child of my actual main app. So this is where all the magic happens, of where the rendezvous happen between the providers that are giving you data and the watches and references to it that happen in the places the data is being used. That's all happening inside the variables in here. Okay. And so we always just put that in on the top. And again, this is my boilerplate because this is exactly the way I construct every new program anyway now. And if you look at PubSpec YAML, well, let's see, I bet we got one down here. You'll see that I have these two dependencies here, Flutter Hooks and Hooks Riverpod. And that just gives us the guts that go behind those import files. Otherwise, everything else is pretty much stock out of the box. Okay. Now, let's go back to main. We've got my app, pretty small, but notice here it's extending Hook Widget. Hook Widget provides a stateless widget, so it has all the same API that StatefulWidget has. But as we'll see a little bit later, it'll allow us to use the hooks as sort of built-ins that apply to the specific build method that's in that particular widget. But so I just have all my widgets are hook widgets, and I can make new hook widgets using the shortcut. I made all this using the shortcut, much easier than typing all this in. Okay, and down here, I thinned this down a little bit if you're familiar with the basic counter app, and who here isn't. All I put in here are the things I'm likely to add. And they're commented out by default because I really didn't need it. And then down here, we've got my home page. And by the way, in the macro that I'm using in Visual Studio Code, I actually ask for what to say instead of my app, what to say instead of my home page. But this is what it comes out of if you just hit return a couple times. Okay, so home is this home page. Home page again extends Hook Widget. Everything I'm doing now, I'm doing with effectively a stateless widget. We can create state by using hooks, and that's one of the fun things. Excuse me, my throat's going away a little bit here. I'll make that happen anyway. And so far, all we have, this is just the boilerplate. is we have the next one down would be the scaffold, the app bar if I wanted it, safe area around a container. And that's pretty much going to be pretty constant with all the possible things. So if we were to compile this, it would do nothing but make it all white. But let's see, we've got the simulator going. We just come up here and hit debug. I can never find the buttons over on the right-hand side, but I know this works. So this is going to build it and show us an all white screen. Ooh, how exciting is that? And this will be the longest we sit for this because everything after this is going to be an incremental build. But I'm just launching for the first time. So everybody go out and grab a drink or something, and then we'll start right back up in a second here. Something else I can tell you first. Sorry?
It's not that bad.
Okay. Yes. Just look around the room for a bit. It's fine. And of course, it takes longer to build for iOS than it does for Android, but I'm sort of an iOS guy, so I have to use all that. I'm not sure why that's true either. I mean, it looks like Android goes through more steps with names. I guess iOS just does it with a lot of stuff behind the scenes in Xcode without telling you the progress it's making. But so this is kind of a nice core, and you see there are places in the comments that are plugged in. Oops! Oh, look at that! We're launching. We're launching. There it is. Our wonderfully nice, completely white screen. Yes, and we're up and running. Yeah, a little debug slash. Didn't even bother removing that. Although I could have made that part of my template too. But what we're going to do now is we're going to add some things that are going to build the counter app. And for the counter app, we're going to build it with stateless widgets, effectively hook widgets or stateless widgets. So we're not going to see any set state in here. And that's another thing I'll be talking about a little later. Okay, so let me come and we're just going to watch through the magic of Git. I push one button and hit return. I guess that would help. And we just added this hook widget down here, and it also caused us to rebuild. Well, it's kind of pointless that it rebuilt. But we made this thing that's essentially my label, and that's going to be the text that goes above the number. So as you recall in the counter app, three things. There's the text at the top, there's the actual count, and then there's a button to push down below. So this didn't do much. It just made that, and it made it, and it just says, yeah, I still can't see it. Why doesn't it see this container here? Well, let's see here. Well, for a couple of things, right? One is a container. I really want to have a text here, okay? And I've got all the full lints turned on. So let me fix that so it doesn't yell at me in blue. Okay, there, I've made that a const. Okay, and we still don't see that, even though I hit save here. We still don't see that. Why don't we see it? Because it's not referenced anywhere else. We have to go up here and put my label up into this part here. No, not that. It's in my homepage. And why isn't it scrolling? Hello. Scroll. Oh, technical problems? Technical problem? No, you should be scrolling. This window's no longer responding. Yeah, let me try this.
Was that reopen?
There's the beach ball of death. Oh, of course, it's a live demo. Of course, there's going to be problems. Yeah, the window has crashed. Well, let's see. So I'm screen sharing the screen. Let me see if I can just revive it here. Hopefully it'll be mostly where it was.
So while that's coming up, that hook widget is, you said it's extending stateless widget, correct?
Yes, hook widget is an add-on, an extension on top of stateless widget. Yes. Okay, well, that part looks right. It's not, it's still got the simulator going. Okay, but it isn't actually running that. Well, the thing we really want to do is, okay, now it's scrolling back down. That's nice. Is that this is really what we're seeing. We're seeing a big blank white container. Okay, that's kind of useless. Let's go into that, and hopefully this didn't break my automatic advanced slide system. No. What did we do? Oh, we just put child my label in here. Now let's build that. And the reason I want to build that is because I want to show. So that's the text you have pressed, but it's in the wrong place, as you'll see. Oh, so I got stuff in the way of stuff that I need to see, like the debugger. Where's the debugger? How do I get rid of this little screen thing? I'm going to put it over there. There, put it over there. Okay. So let's just do this. Let's go to the debugger, run on debug. There, now I get my little debug row of buttons. That's handy. Okay, here's again where it's going to take some time because we lost the actual connection. I think only some of it needs to be recompiled, but I don't know. But anyway, what we've done is this was a container. Now it's my label there. Oh, it's installing it on my phone. No. You ever had a day like that? This needs to be over here. And now, how far do I have to remove it? Okay, let's debug it again. You'd think I was a pro. Okay, well, I wasn't counting on that to crash. You're never counting on things to crash. Isn't that always the way? Okay, so click. Just have to wait for that to finish. And I'm going to make a series of changes that you'll see in a minute to get the text into the right place and into a column, but we'll see that in a moment or two. So how's that weather out there? Yeah.
So while that's building, just
Yes.
reiterate the point so we can just use this time effectively. So the creator of Riverpod, his problem with provider was that, so what can you give me like 3 bullet points?
Yeah. So provider identified things up above it in the tree by using a class. And the problem is that classes are global. So if you wanted 2 providers that both wanted to provide an int, you couldn't. You had to essentially create another class that was a wrapper around an int and give it a different name. You couldn't have 2 int providers or 2 daytime providers or things like that. Yeah. Okay, here we go. So it says you have pressed way up there in the corner. You need to fix that. Let's add some stuff to that here. Let's whoa, and we blew up. Oh, that's also fun. I swear I rehearsed this, and we got a red screen. One at a time with this. Okay, there we go. What I did was I changed the size of the text. And why am I in errors patch? Okay, I changed the size of the text because that was too small for a demo. Okay, I fixed that. So now it's big, but it's also in the wrong corner. So let's fix that. And hopefully it won't blow up quite as much now. Do that. Okay, there we go. We centered it by putting it somehow. It should be showing up. How did we get centered? Oh, I put text align center. There we go. So now it's centered, but it's still way up at the top. So let's fix that. And there we go. Now we didn't see any change with that because what I did is I surrounded this in the center. Nothing really changed there, but I'm leading towards something here. So I want to go. What did I just change? Let's see here. Did these get saved? Let's see. So the center is here, right? Okay. Cancel. Okay. Oh, create my count. Oh, I copied some stuff down. There we go. So the label is here. You have pressed. I copied it to the count. So that the label's pretty much done. It's going to sit right there. It's just going to have a good time so far. Okay. And so we got my count. So we're going to put that in there. And then we're going to add it to the column. Okay. And there's my label. Oh, and we put a column in so that we could add it up there. And now we've got a column of my label and my count, but since they're the same text, you see it twice. But it's also still way up here at the top. We got to fix that. I think we can fix that by fixing the height of the column so that it gets centered better. So I put a main exercise min. Now the column is really just from the top to the bottom of these things. That's the start of the column. This is the end of the column. So it's pretty close. If I thought it wouldn't break anything, I'd now open DevTools to show you that precisely. No, I'm not going to risk having yet another thing up on the screen. I already have bad feelings about this. Okay, so that's good, except now we need to fix the text on the bottom one. I think that's what the next one does. Yeah, okay. So, and I changed the text in the other one. So now this is the text on the top, on the label. This is the text on the counter. Still not exciting. Just have a literal 0 there for now. Let's go ahead and actually get that 0 from somewhere. So here I have the first thing that's really of Riverpod being shown besides the hook widgets. And this is how you build a state provider. A state provider contains a single object that's put in the thing that's called .state in there. Ref is used for chaining these together. Like I could say that this value depends on some other value from another provider. So you can create an arbitrary network with Riverpod of all of these different things. In provider, you had to do that with multi-provider. This is much simpler. The whole interface is much simpler. Right. But we're not doing that. We're letting the 0 stand alone, and we're putting a state provider. Now, if we hover over this, we see that it is inferred that it's an int. So the state variable inside is definitely an int. It's definitely typed as an int, which will become important a little bit later. Okay, and this is doing nothing really. This gets initialized at global time. So in other words, when all your globals are initialized, which is pretty early, I think it's even before the beginning of run, it's way early. So, but that's fine. This essentially creates a template that can hold a 0 at the moment and will hold other numbers later. And it's not until we actually use it in some way, either through a watch or a read, which we'll get to, that this actually comes alive and gets wired into the dependency mechanism. So that's nice. We can see that there. But again, the 0 that's down here is still hardwired. Let's fix that. Okay, now, and this might be one where it blows up. Let's see. No, here's something new. Use provider. Now, this is a Riverpod hook. This is a hook, meaning it's going to come from the Flutter hook package at its basis and needs to be in a hook widget like this. But it actually is something that Riverpod and hooks have to intersect to provide that. And that's because besides just being a hook, it also has to tie into the dependency mechanism. What I'm saying here with use provider is we have this provider up here called counter, a couple lines up. Okay, this counter, when it changes and sends out its notifications that it's changed, needs to inform this widget such that we're now going to rebuild it. Similar to provider and watch does, but this is, I think, a nice tinier syntax. And normally, if I was using provider at this point, I'd have to essentially create a nested consumer widget inside this to get the watch operation. Whereas this is effectively watch without all the extra syntax and overhead. Now, this use provider returns the internal state. In fact, if I do this for a second, you'll see what kind of an object this is. So we see that we have things like add listener, debug, state. In fact, now actually, if we go in here, we just look at what counter is, it's going to break other things, but I'll go back and fix that in a second. What this is, it's a state controller. And a state controller has a series of methods to manage the state, which we just saw a moment ago, these dot things. Okay, so hash code mounted, debug state, dispose. It's got all of that stuff. Give me a stream from there and so on. So we could actually extract this as a stream. Let me go ahead and put state back there again, and we'll see now that state is that int that we had. So here's the things you can do to an int, because that's where we're at right now. This is the int. So by putting int state there, we're getting the current state that's inside the counter provider. Okay. Now it's unfortunate the word provider is used both by provider, the package formal, and Riverpod, because they're actually a lot of the same code internally, but this is all called providers again, even though they're not provider package. It gets a little confusing sometimes. But now what I do is I take count and I simply put it inside there, and I'm happy. If I hit Command S here now again, it should blow up, right? Nope, it didn't blow up. How nice of that? Okay, now this still says 0, but this 0 is now a value that we got from doing use provider to watch the provider and link it to this thing. As it changes, it will cause this particular widget to rebuild. And we've linked that together now. Okay.
Change it to 1 so we can prove it's coming from there.
Sorry, what?
Change it to 1 so we can prove that it's coming from the counter.
I will with the button. Well, I can show you that it doesn't.
Yeah.
If I just do a soft, fast reload, fast reload.
We'll do a hot reload, yeah.
Yeah, and the reason that a hot reload as opposed to a hot restart won't change it is because it's not reinitializing that counter, because it's a
so that's a good point. So you need hot restart then, right?
You need a hot restart, but crossing fingers.
Yeah.
Yep, there it is. Okay. So you're right. That's the tie-in from the one to the other. Both call 1. Let me go back to 0 though. 0 is where I liked it. And then again, we're going to have to do a
hot restart.
Hot restart to get it back to 0. Hopefully that saved the files first. Yeah. Okay. Good. It did. I never know if it's saving it or not. Okay. Bingo. Now we're getting there. We've got a value that if we could just figure out how to change it, will be the value that we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some stuff that will most certainly break hot reload. So let's see how well it breaks it. Okay, well, first we're doing is we're adding our button. Okay, and it's just going to return a container for now. But I think the next step I do is I add it to my ever-growing column. Let's see, probably. Yep, okay, so now my button is down there, and because it's still a container, it ain't got nothing, right? Okay, so we're seeing the invisible container down here, right? Right below this with the 0 width and height. Okay, so let's go one more step by moving my pointer back to the right place. There we go. Okay, button. Oh, exciting. Okay, empty callback for onPressed. So it means it'll react with the colors. See, it's doing its normal onPressed stuff. So it's pretty, but it doesn't do anything still. I have friends like that. And so the text has pressed me, and that's getting closer now. But how do we make it so that the action here changes and informs the counter to do something different? Well, it'll be similar to what you've done with StatefulWidgets with setState, where what you do is you change some value in your state, and then you call setState to tell the widget that it needs to be rebuilt. So it'll be similar here, but I think a little bit more elegant and a little bit more controllable. Okay, so this syntax is kind of ugly. It's not symmetrical with the use provider, but Remy thought about making those more similar, and it just didn't gain anything. It would just break a bunch of code that's already written this way. So what this says is use the context from the current build, which is this context here, right? And read. The difference between read and use provider or read and watch is, am I just getting the current value, or am I just accessing current value, or am I wanting to listen for changes so that I can be notified to refresh myself? Okay. Well, we're not going to actually be interested in counter changing somewhere. We don't need to refresh the button. Button can stay same exact way, unless we were like changing the color of the button forward and forward and forward every time I press the button, then it would have to rebuild based on the count, but we're not doing that. But also notice what we're doing here. So read counter is similar to use provider counter in that it's giving us back that the state controller that's underneath this. I forget where that's, I can see that. Oh, I have to pull this back off to do that. Okay. But dot state is once again that state value that's inside the provider, inside the state controller, actually. Now, when you're exposing it this way, it's an L value, which means I can assign something new to it. And that would directly reach over and change the 0. And as long as it changes in a way that's not equals. So for example, if you change just adding an element inside an array, that's still equals equals, by the way, because it's the same object. That hasn't changed. That's when you got to start thinking about equatable and all the other ways of having deep equality instead of just shallow equality. But again, that's a whole another hour, so I'm not going to get into much of that. Let me just say that what's happening here is I'm doing state plus plus, which means that I'm changing the 0 into a 1 in a way that it's not equal anymore to its previous value. So inside the state controller, it's actually keeps the old value when it gives you a new value and doesn't do anything if that doesn't change. Okay, but we'll increment the state. And as a matter of incrementing the state, this provider will then notify anybody who has subscribed to it via, say, use listener or a watch call in a builder method or anything like that, any place that, say, provider or Riverpod would have normally watched to each other. So with just a couple, 3 lines of code, actually, creating the counter, subscribing to it here to get the value, and using the provider to update the value, we have done the work of the set state and the stateful thing and everything. And we've knitted it to an initial value and all that stuff. So I push the button over here. As long as it doesn't blow up, hey, there you go. Bing, 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 right? Exactly as we would expect. And every time I'm pressing this, it's doing this here to go find the counter provider, that's this, and then read its current state and increment that current state and put it back into the same value. Plus equals 1 would have done exactly the same thing. Adding things onto the end of a string, as long as you're mutating it, also would be fine. Anything that mutates the state will be enough to trigger the provider up here to then notify everybody who's curious about it, everybody who's listening to it. And use provider is the quickest way to do that in this framework. Okay, that's close to the end of my demo. Let me go a couple more slides here. Okay, so what I wanted to show is how often things are actually getting rebuilt. So let me find out where I used to change the thing down there. Okay, let's clear that too. Okay, so what I've added now is I've added a series of debug prints. So this is going to tell me when my button, my count, my label, my home page, and my app are all built. And I'll show you why this is important, because let's do a full restart just in case things might go crazy here. Okay, well, there we go. See, we built the app, the home page, the label, the count, and the button in order to display this. That makes sense. Okay, let me press the button. And notice the only thing that popped up over here is that my count got rebuilt. It didn't rebuild the material app. It didn't rebuild the home page. It didn't rebuild even the label, because the label didn't change. It's just the counter that changed. Now and here I am. If I keep pressing it, notice it's just rebuilding my count. And that's because even though we're in the button, right? We're in this never gets rebuilt because there's nothing to change. This is the blue area here. There's nothing changing there. So it doesn't have to rebuild that. And it doesn't have to rebuild the label, nothing to go there, but instead it has the only thing that's actually listening to the counter change is right there. And that's why it's rebuilding that.
That's one of the bragging points of Riverpod, I guess, as opposed to some of the other state management systems, is that it only builds what it needs to build, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, they all have some way of narrowing the scope of what gets rebuilt. Just as some are a lot more clumsy than others.
Yeah.
Like before Riverpod Hook, you had to do it down here. Where's my user provider? There it is. You had to do it down here by creating inside this widget another widget called a consumer widget, or a provider builder, or something like that. There's like 2 or 3 different ways to do it, even with Riverpod. But before you had this, you had to have all that extra boilerplate, and this is trivial. And you could even be watching 2 different things, and if either one of them fires, you get rebuilt. And again, that's trivial to add. It's so much nicer that way. So like if we had a stream of one stuff coming in from one place and a stream of stuff coming in from the other place,
Right.
we could do the value of both of those, stick those in a ticker list across the top of the screen, and either one coming in would build the whole widget again.
Yeah, I don't know if you have it in your presentation, but at some point, if we have time, I wanted to ask you some of the common providers that useful providers. You're giving a state provider, which is probably a very common way, common provider. But so I have it in my questions to ask you, what are some of the other providers that
Okay, I'm one slide away from being done, so let me do that.
Okay.
Okay, so here's my final slide. And my final slide, if you'll notice, is not for any particular reason. I just, must be way up here. Where's my other use? There it is. So just for grins, I'm not doing anything with the value of the counter up here in my homepage. And by the way, think about that for a second. That means that it's actually would have been sort of above the place where it got created if you were using provider, if you're using the classic provider package, because you always have to be below the thing that holds the value. Here you don't. Here I'm actually above it, but I'm saying please subscribe and throw away the value for the counter. But by putting this in there, let me get rid of everything down here first. Okay, we're going to do a full reload just so it doesn't go mad. Okay, now, things we expected: app, my homepage, label, count, button. The 5 things that have to be built have been built. But I press the button and watch. Oh, look, it built both my homepage and my count. And that's because both of those widgets subscribed to listening for the counter to change. But I had specific control of that by what I put on that one line. If it didn't need that value, I don't have to subscribe to it, and it doesn't get anything rebuilt. Much nicer that way.
Yeah.
And I think that's my end. Let's see here. Push the button for next. Oh, yep, didn't do anything. Okay, so that's sort of the code part of my presentation. You were asking about common providers.
Yeah, some of the other common providers. I'm looking at the documentation. They have some different providers. Some of them are probably used less frequently than others. So if you can just give us a few highlights of
pretty much everything that has a listen mechanism. So in other words, everywhere where there's something that can send out notifications to something else, those all have specifically named providers. So for example, you might have used a change notifier before. Well, there's a change notifier provider that essentially wraps that and acts like this. But the nice thing about doing it with this, with a provider, is that it automatically unlistens rather than you having to first say, well, watch this change notifier with a listen and a callback in my state, and then dispose of it in a dispose. You just simply do right there. It's going to be exactly the same thing as I do for using counter here. And that's going to make it much simpler. So that there's like change notifier provider, state notifier provider is essentially what I built here. There's also just a raw provider, and that's just there's no exposed state. You're expected to make changes to the insides by implementing methods that you can call. In the same way that we could get to dot state here, you could get to dot foo if the internal class defines a foo. And what's fun about that is that it can also wire into the dispose mechanism. So if you had something you wanted to create, but then whenever it was using it is gone, you could have it, it'll automatically call back to ref.dispose. That's what that ref is for. And then you can put a hook on that. But you can also do ref.watch or ref.read other providers and essentially build a directed tree of this depends on this, which depends on this, which depends on this. And some of those things can even be like future provider or stream provider that provide a nice wrapper around a future or a stream so that, for example, one thing that's commonly a bit of trouble is when you have a stream and you're just coming along to listen to it, you don't have the most recent value. If you say dot last, it drains the whole stream and gives you the last thing. That's not very useful. If you say next, well, it waits for it to come out with one more thing. It doesn't have the most recent transmission. A stream provider holds that for you. So when you come along, you get the first value, that the most recent first value, and then you get all the notifications for the later ones. So it's actually quite nice to have that. You would pay extra money for Flutter Plus or Flutter Improved. You don't get that otherwise. Riverpod gives it to you for free.
Nice.
And now how much would you pay?
We like Riverpod.
So there's that whole category of things that are basically things that are wrappers around other behavior, like streams and futures and state changes and just arbitrary change notification with arbitrary methods. So you could essentially, in 3 or 4 lines, build what we give to qubits. And with a few more lines, you can do a whole block. And in fact, there's a thing called River Block that is essentially blocks built using Riverpod to show how straightforward it is.
Oh, wow.
And that way you can mix and match all that stuff together in the same application. So that's all one category of things that can send out notifies when parts of them change.
Right.
Then there's the other category of thing called Flutter Hooks, which again are the mimicking of the hooks stuff. With that, you could build a stateful variable that's scoped only to one class. Like here,
like in our example.
You could come down in here. Let's see if I can do it without breaking anything. So down here in the count, we can say inside the build, we can say final, no, it's not, it'll be late. No, that's final value equals use memoized. And what this is going to do is it's only going to run this function, which could be something complex like datetime now, that actually changes over time, but use memoize is defined for my count.
Is D? There's a D up here?
Memoized, maybe. Bang. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So what this is this is going to be a date time. It inferred it from way over here, but it's only going to call this function once until this widget is completely thrown away. Like if this was on one page and you went to the next page and then you came back to the first page, this would be local again and initialized again to that value. And it's automatically disposed as well. So this is where you can start avoiding using any stateful widgets, Now, if you're doing a migration and you want hooks, but you don't want to get rid of your wonderful stateful widgets because you put a lot of time and care and energy into them, you can change this hook widget to stateful hook widget and change a couple of the names of the subclasses. Like it's no longer state for the subclass, it's hook state. But with that, you're done. It just works. It's a pretty much a drop.
There's a stateful hook widget, huh? I didn't know that.
Yeah, stateful hook widget. Yeah.
Awesome.
Remy thought of a lot of things.
Man,
and
I
there's
love
definitely a lot of stuff here.
This is why you love Flutter, right? The ecosystem is so powerful. People, it's
Yeah.
such a dynamic ecosystem.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's why it's growing so fast in popularity.
Yep. I imagine so.
Yep.
So any more questions before I?
So yeah. So we do have some in the chat box. So
I wasn't watching.
so
sorry.
the unavoidable question every meetup comes up, and I like this question actually. What are Randall's favorite VS Code extensions plugins for Flutter Dart?
Oh my God.
And you have only 2 minutes. Don't go over that.
It'll take a lot longer.
Let's stick to the topic.
Let me see if I can sort by Flutter because that might be a good way to. Okay, of course, Flutter. Awesome Flutter is Flutter snippets. I don't know what Flutter files is. I never know. Oh, it's install. How about add install? These are the ones that actually.
I know you said you have a gazillion plugins, right? So
yeah, there. Okay, there's the ones that are just installed. I think. Now, how do I get rid of this little banner here? I don't know how. VS Code, you drive me nuts sometimes. Okay, Flutter color is what's giving the rainbow over here on the left side to see how indented it is. That's really nice. Oh no, I think that's the coloring of, I don't know, it's coloring something. That's all it is. Helps you easily see stuff. And Riverpod snippets are pretty small and long, old, and they're no longer compatible. So I should actually delete that. Flutter snippets is good. That's the things where you get at stateful and stateless and things like that.
Actually, hold your thought, please. So that Riverpod snippets, you said that's outdated. Is there a replacement for that? Because that would be useful.
No. And if I knew how to build an extension and I didn't have to relearn TypeScript, which I think it takes, I could make my two things from being just a see, I have it just as a where's this snippet? It's not there. Want to go snippets? Snippets. Yeah, configure user snippets. Okay, in the Dart language. So I have, this is my Riverpod Flutter boilerplate, right? And here's the hook widget, so I can automatically produce a hook widget. And here's a thing that I use to automatically apply a font scale factor. So I have those, but I don't know how to publish that except by giving you a gist or something, and you have to install it yourself.
Yeah.
But that's probably useful at some point. I might do that. Okay. Let's see what else I got that's fun and cool here. Let me close these down here. Well, that got rid of that little bar that was up there. Okay. And okay, so not too many that say the word Flutter in them. One of the ones I really like, oh, I got to say Dart too. That's probably why. A lot of things are Dart.
Yeah.
This is one of the ones I really like, the Dart data class generator, because it knows how to take JSON or just take a class that has final members and generate getters and setters if you want, can generate a constructor, and it's non-null by default compatible. So you just required rather than at required. And or to generate to JSON and from JSON. This can be done with, build time stuff, but I like to have it right there in my editor in case I want to customize some piece of it, because that's kind of nice to have. So I use that a lot. Dart export file generator. I don't care about that. Dart import. Oh, fixing the imports. That's a lot of fun. So there's a fix import command here that goes into the top of your file and sorts them, but also changes all of the package local references to relative references like they're supposed to be. It's amazing how many other things actually put it as a package reference, which it shouldn't be. JSON Dart model. That's sort of a different one like the other one, but that's probably the quickest
Got
one.
the
I
getters
also
and setters. What's in that? Is that like
in what? Sorry.
get the getters and setters, the Dart getters and setters? Yeah, is that
Yeah,
one?
that generates something, things that are almost completely useless in Dart. They're handy when you're coming from a Java world where the syntax for invoking a getter is different from the syntax for just getting a member. And so if you ever think you want to change it, you have to do it one way or the other. You have to commit. With Flutter, you can take, or Dart, I should say, you can take and make something that looks like a member today be actually a getter and a setter tomorrow. And none of the people that call it change. There's no change to the calling protocol because it's all .foo, .bar, like that. So that's a really nice thing. So you don't really need that because you can always turn an individual entry into a getter or a setter.
Project Lombok with Java has a famous one. I don't know if you remember, you know it, but yeah, that's a very useful. Okay, so let's go to the next question. So Larry asks,
I'm trying to find out where the questions are. Let's see. So they're on.
Yeah. So
because I'm sharing. It's probably because I'm sharing it.
Yeah. No, I'll read them out.
Okay.
That's why it's more. That way, it's more interactive. Also.
Oh, cool.
So Larry asks, what are the advantages of the consumer widget over the use provider?
It's well, for one, if you're just bringing in Riverpod, it's one of the standard Riverpod widgets. Flutter Hooks, as much as I like to lump that all in together, is actually a separate sort of project and has a different sort of style of things. And because all hooks use roughly the same technology, no matter what, whenever it's used something, they do some weird stuff behind the scenes. They essentially create a stateful element. It's not quite a widget because it doesn't have any view time on the screen, but it's basically, it has all the same protocols that the build system can inform it when it's being created, when it's being moved, when it's being deleted. So it kind of sits over there looking like any other widget, but that gives it stateful access to things, all that sort of stuff. All that state that you're hiding away from here is all magically going into that widget. Now, there's some requirements for that. They're stored by ordinal number. So if you change the order of the things you're creating in a widget, it breaks. And I frequently, when I add or delete something, I end up hot restarting instead of hot reloading. It'll just end up with a red screen because the count is off by one or whatever. And it details that in the hooks documentation. So it tells you don't do this. And I still end up doing it anyway.
Yeah.
A consumer widget is also more bulkier. I mean, you would have to say, now this is the value I want to watch. And it ultimately boils down to just an extra layer of build. That's fine. But if that's the only thing that you're building in your widget, and you have to have the outer protocol because of compatibility, then you're screwed basically putting a build right inside a build. So it's a little silly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so Neil asked a few questions. He said, can you store complex object graphs in state? And if so, does updating one piece of it only trigger a re-render for a UI that listens to just that piece? Or
yes,
does it trigger re-render for anything that subscribes to any state update?
Well, you're talking about state first. So is that talking about a state of a stateful widget, or is that state as in the abstract notion of what Riverpod can do? I need that clarified, or I'm not going to be able to answer it.
Yeah, so let's go to the next question. He'll probably answer that question. He'll probably answer your question. So he says, what are the best practices for loading up a provider from an external data source and then sharing it across widgets and updating the external data source as needed?
All of the ways to use a Riverpod provider provide a way to do dot refresh, which essentially tells the provider under scrutiny that it should consider itself launching freshly. So if it had providers that it in turn depended on, they wouldn't get re-notified unless you added that to the particular provider itself. You can actually tell it to cascade, or you can simply use the existing values that it already knew about. So it's pretty clever actually that way. But you're basically, yes, building up a network of this depends on that depends on those two things. And you can tell the system to refresh any one of those directly or indirectly.
Right. So Neil answered the question. I guess he said, I guess the former. So you gave us two options, which was that.
I got to remember what the two things were.
Yeah. You said state of,
Yeah.
And then what was that? The second one?
Was just using the Riverpod notifiers talking to each other.
Yeah, he said the former, the first one, the first option, which would just
Doesn't have any capability like that. All you can do with state is you can update a state value and you can call set state. And when you call set state, it's the whole kit and caboodle. You're saying basically something here changed.
Right.
But you don't have any more fine-grained control over it. If it was a series of Riverpod providers, you could have exactly what needs to get notified downstream, including if you notify things downstream and they don't rebuild and they're a stateful watcher, they're not going to notify any of their parents at all, or children, I guess, at all, because they didn't change state. This is really handy when you have a list that came from a query, and you also have a filtered list. The filtered list would depend on what the filter is and on the main list. Okay. So unless either of those rebuild, the filtered list is a done deal. You can use it as a list builder and everything like that. But if now the user says, I want to change what I'm filtering on, well, that doesn't need to go out and get the original list again, because you're just filtering that. So that stays alone. And the filter does its filter computation again and provides the new filtered value. So, but if for some reason the original list changes, like maybe it's getting refreshed because of some further upstream thing, like maybe a stream has been notified, you've got a new batch or something like that, then that will trickle down all the way to the filtered list because of all the dependency management.
Yeah, yeah. Can you go to that use memoized example, if you don't mind?
Let's see. How do you
Still have it up there somewhere, right? On the left-hand side, left tab.
Okay, just trying to find my mouse.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, you're on it right there. So,
Yeah, there we go.
so he says, so let me look at that. So he says, how do you let use memoized know that the memoized value is state?
Memoized is defined that way. Memoized has the classic memoized meaning. In other words, here is a function to run. You run it the first time and you never run it again, unless you give arguments out here.
Oh,
like
there has
maybe,
those options. Okay.
Yeah, like maybe what's it, right? And now, if what's it changes,
Right.
it will regenerate datetime now.
Right.
So it's a memoized value based on a set of arguments.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Tim Whiting asks, you can pass in a key that changes when the, oh, he's answering the question. He says you can pass in a key that changes when the memoized value is state, and it will recompute the memoized function, which is what you just said.
That's the key there. Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly. And he says also, just continuing on the answer, you can store large objects and you can create providers that only listen to a bit of state to filter rebuilds on a small bit of the state. There's new syntax coming to be able to listen to a small portion of the state in your widgets as well. So
Yeah.
that's the pipeline, I guess.
Yep. Dot select is already there. It's been in there. It was all the way back in provider, and it's implemented in Riverpod as well in a more efficient way.
And Neil said the inspiration from React is pretty clear.
Yeah. Yeah. There's use effect, which is really nice. You could put a one-liner that has hooks in so that at essentially a single subroutine does both the init state and then returns a callback for what to do during dispose. So you can customize any init state dispose pairing that you want. And you could hide all that behind a class object and use the same template for a lot of different things. And that's essentially what use state is and stuff is doing. Although I don't have a use state here. That's similar. And the only reason I didn't use this in this example is I could have also said final count equals use state. May actually see how I type, which is why I pre-programmed all this. Use state ref 0, I think. Is it? Let's see. What's it want? Does it want the ref or not? It wants initial data. That's it. So use state 0. And there is also a counter that starts at 0. But to get that down to the two different widgets that need to know about it, it's a little harder. That's why I used a global provider instead. But that, if you just wanted a scratch value in this particular element, there you go. That's a 0. That's a state that starts out as 0. If anybody changes it, like we came in here and went count dot state, I think it is, or value, might be value. You never know which ones are value, which ones are count dot value. It's one of those. Wait, what's count? Maybe I'm wrong here. Value notifier, right? So, so that would be a value. So count dot value dot that's an int. So you could do count dot value plus plus, and there I've just changed count dot value here inside this widget, but this widget also subscribes to it. So that means it's automatically going to get rebuilt, which is sort of silly since you're writing the same thing. But, and I imagine you could probably hand count off through parameters being passed down and up, but I'm not sure how much I'd want to do that. It probably makes it more complicated than it has to be.
So Larry asked, if you create a provider with state in one package and consume that in another package, are there any complications?
As far as Dart is concerned, everything's in one giant file. No.
Cool.
Except for two things. We actually had the discussion earlier on Discord. There are two things that putting everything into one file eliminates that you can't do anymore. Can't import some of the things with prefixes. You know, like if you like the HTTP package has HTTP in front of all the operations, can't do that. And because you can't say there's a prefix for this chunk of code here. And the other thing is that underscore means private, but it means private to the current library, which by default is the current file. So underscores would be prefix underscores would be completely meaningless. Anything could get to any member of anything. So that's the only reason you can't think of it just being in one file. You have to think about different files.
Okay. So Ragnar Tolgo says, I've been using Riverpod consumer widget instead of hook widget. Should I change this to hook widget instead? Well,
use whatever's appropriate at the time. I mean, there's hook widgets are sort of things. Well, it's similar to React hooks. It's things to enable adding behavior that would typically span an init state and a dispose, and you want to get that behavior encapsulated as its own thing. For example, use text editing controller. A text editing controller has to be init stated and disposed to really work properly and not leak anything. Here, I would go foo equals use text editing controller, and it's done. Now this foo, when the widget is disposed, automatically takes the text editing controller down with it. So a lot of things that have the combination of an init state and a dispose can be refactored nicely into their own packages like that.
So I guess one last question is that in the beginning, we couldn't get the state by doing a hot reload. We had to do a hot restart, right?
Yes.
That's always going to be the case, correct? Or is there any?
It's always been the case and always will be the case
Because you
for
have
things that are initialized at a global level like this.
exactly, because you need to get the state refresh of the context,
Right.
of the whole
right.
build tree and so forth. Yes. Okay.
But oddly, because the build is being called again for the thing down below that you're rebuilding. Oh, where did I put the use state? I put it up higher, I think. Where did I put it? Oh, maybe I deleted it. Okay, but use state is in the build method, not in the global initialization phase. So that would, in fact, I believe, reset back to 0 because all the widgets would be torn down and created back up again. Only state gets preserved, and that's not considered part of the state. So.
Okay, any closing thoughts? Larry, do you have anything? Michael, Kalu, anything from your end?
No.
Okay, well, this is another great presentation. Thank you, Randall. Anything, any final thoughts, Randall?
No, just I enjoy talking about this stuff. I just found out today that there's a Riverpod Discord specifically for Riverpod.
Okay.
And yet they have on there a Riverpod channel. So I'm trying to figure out if that's the Riverpodiest channel in the world. Riverpod on a Riverpod server.
Yeah.
Riverpod version.
Does Flutter community Slack, does it have a channel for state or anything like that? Because
there's some they kind of ended up scattered. And they also end up multi-posted. Anytime I see that, I go in and say, don't do that.
Multi-posting. Yeah.
Not really clear. I have delete authority on the community Slack. So I just go and delete everything except one. I don't mind if they post. I just don't want them to post everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah.
And it's clearly not both a beginner question and an advanced question. Those are opposite, absolutely opposite, diametrically opposite. There's no way it could be both.
Right. Yeah.
But as an answerer, I run into a lot of things like that, like people posting at roughly the same time, both on Discord and Stack Overflow and the community Slack. And it's like, okay, I just spent time answering for you over on Stack Overflow.
Right.
And now you're over here asking the very same question. I know you asked that before I gave an answer, but can't you see that people who have answers are the limited resource here? There's not an infinite number of us. So if you do that kind of shenanigans, it really just irritates the people that you want to get help from.
Time is scarce and valuable. Absolutely. Thank you for your time, Randall. I really appreciate everything you're doing for the community and for coming here today and just giving us a good hour plus time of your day or evening talking about Riverpod. Thank you for joining, everyone, and we'll see you at the next DC Flutter meetup. Take care.